Chapter 18. Ooh, this is exciting. I like this one. So we know that Elizabeth is hoping, well, just like the other sisters, except for Jane, are hoping to dance the whole night with Wickham at the Netherfield ball. We know that Mr. Collins totally spoiled Elizabeth's plans because he asked her for the first two dances. Now, these dances are like 15 minutes long each, or maybe longer than that. So to dance two of them with Mr. Collins, it's like a 30-minute dancing time. It's like, ooh, Anyway, all right, chapter 18. Till Elizabeth entered the drawing room at Netherfield and looked in vain for Mr. Wickham among the cluster of redcoats there assembled, a doubt of his being present had never occurred to her. So she's like, oh my gosh, what if he's not here? The certainty of meeting him had not been checked by any of those recollections that might not unreasonably have alarmed her. She had dressed with more than usual care, and prepared in the highest spirits for the conquest of all that remained unsubdued of his heart, trusting that it was not more than might be won in the course of the evening. So it says here that she took good care, or like she made sure that she looked like amazing that night. She was just drop dead gorgeous, okay, because she said that she knows she can capture him in one night, that's it. Like, she just has to look great, speak to him well, and that's it. He's gonna love her, and she's gonna capture him, and they're gonna be a couple, right? Oh, hold on, those are my cinnamon rolls. Okay, they needed a little bit more time. Hold on. All right, so she's drop dead gorgeous right now, but she's like, gosh, dog it, he might not even be here. But in an instant arose the dreadful suspicion of his being purposely omitted for Mr. Darcy's pleasure in the Bingleys' invitation to the officers. And though this was not exactly the case, the absolute fact of his absence was pronounced by his friend Mr. Denny, to whom Lydia eagerly applied, and who told him that Wickham had been obliged to go to town on business the day before and was not yet returned, adding with a significant smile, I do not imagine his business would have called him away just now if he had not wished to avoid a certain gentleman here. So Denny is basically saying that Wickham wanted to avoid Darcy. Okay. This part of his intelligence, though unheard by Lydia, was caught by Elizabeth, and as it assured her that Darcy was not less answerable for Wickham's absence than if her first surmise had been just, every feeling of displeasure against the former was so sharpened by immediate disappointment that she could hardly reply with tolerable civility to the polite inquiries which he directly afterwards approached to make. So she was so irritated that Wickham would not have gone to the ball because of Darcy, even though it's not Darcy's fault. I mean, Wickham's the one who chose that. She was still pretty upset with Darcy. She's like, oh, that's his fault. And so when he tried to talk to her, she's like, get out of here, right? So, attention, forbearance, patience with Darcy was injury to Wickham. She's like, oh, if I'm going to be nice to Darcy, that's like being insulting to Wickham. She was resolved against any sort of conversation with him, and turned away with a degree of ill humor which she could not wholly surmount even in speaking to Mr. Bingley, whose blind partiality provoked her. So she was even irritated with Mr. Bingley just because they were friends. It's more like, you can't be her friend because we're not friends. I mean, that's just so so high school. Anyway. But Elizabeth was not formed for ill humor. She's like, she really didn't have it in her to be like that. And though every prospect of her own was destroyed for the evening, it could not dwell long on her spirits. And having told all her griefs to Charlotte Lucas, whom she had not seen for a week, she was soon able to make a voluntary transition to the oddities of her cousin, and to point him out to her particular notice. So Elizabeth got over it a little bit. She was like, yeah, disappointed that Wickham wasn't there, but she's like, let me just chit-chat with Charlotte. This will be fun. So she makes fun of Mr. Collins for fun. The two first dances, however, brought a return of distress. They were dances of mortification. Mr. Collins, awkward and solemn and apologizing instead of attending, and often moving wrong without being aware of it, gave her all the shame and misery which a disagreeable partner for a couple of dances can give. The moment of her release from him was ecstasy. So she was super embarrassed to dance with Mr. Collins. He was such a pain in the butt. That is my oven. Let me go check on my cinnamon rolls. Okay, I forgot to turn the oven back on, so now they have to stay in a little bit longer. Anyway, all right, I'll show you what they look like later. She danced next with an officer and had the refreshment of talking of Wickham and of hearing that he was universally liked. When those dances were over, she returned to Charlotte Lucas and was in conversation with her when she found herself suddenly addressed by Mr. Darcy, who took her so much by surprise in his application for her hand that without knowing what she did, she accepted him. But she promised to never dance with him, but she said yes because he took her by surprise. He walked away again immediately, and she was left to fret over her own want of presence of mind. Charlotte tried to console her. I dare say you will find him very agreeable. Heaven forbid! That would be the greatest misfortune of all, to find a man agreeable whom one is determined to hate. Do not wish me such an evil. She's like, don't hope that I like him. No, that would be terrible. When the dancing recommenced, however, and Darcy approached to claim her hand, Charlotte could not help cautioning her in a whisper not to be a simpleton and to allow her fancy for Wickham to make her appear unpleasant in the eyes of a man, oftentimes his consequence. Elizabeth made no answer and took her place in the set, amazed at the dignity to which she was arrived in being allowed to stand opposite to Mr. Darcy, and reading in her neighbor's looks their equal amazement in beholding it. It says, Elizabeth made no answer and took her place in the set, amazed at the dignity to which she was arrived in being allowed to stand opposite to Mr. Darcy. So just standing next to him elevated her in people's eyes, and she was like, oh, this is something else, you know. Oh, hold on. Okay, they're ready. Y'all want to see them? Hold on, let me go see. Cinnamon rolls. Kitchen's a little messy. Yummy cinnamon rolls from scratch. Don't you just love it? Okay, that's enough of that. Oh, there's my son. Okay, so where were we? Hold on, let me check. Oh, right. So just standing beside Mr. Darcy, elevated her in status in people's eyes. She felt it. Anyway, so they stood for some time without speaking a word, and she began to imagine that their silence was to last through the two dances, and at first was resolved not to break it. She's like, nope, I'm not talking to him. Till suddenly fancying that it would be the greater punishment to her partner to oblige him to talk, she made some slight observation on the dance. So she's like, nope, I'm going to punish him because I know he doesn't want to talk, so I'm going to make him talk. He replied and was again silent. After a pause of some minutes, she addressed him with a second time with, it is your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance, and you ought to make some kind of remark on the size of the room or the number of couples. He smiled and assured her that whatever she wished him to say should be said. Very well, that reply will do for the present. Perhaps by and by I may observe that private balls are much pleasanter than public ones, but now we may be silent. Do you talk by rule, then, while you are dancing? Sometimes. One must speak a little, you know. It would look odd to be entirely silent for half an hour together, and yet for the advantage of some, conversation ought to be so arranged as that they may have the trouble of saying as little as possible. Are you consulting your own feelings in the present case, or do you imagine that you are gratifying mine? Both, replied Elizabeth archly, for I have always seen a great similarity in the turn of our minds. We are each of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room, and be handed down to posterity with all the elect of a proverb. So she's like, oh no, we're the same, but she's really just mocking him, saying that when they speak, they expect to be listened to, and if they're giving this great old speech. There is no very striking resemblance of your own character, I am sure, he said. How near it may be to mine, I cannot pretend to say. You think it is a faithful portrait, undoubtedly. He's like, yeah, I doubt you're like that. He's like, and I'm pretty sure you really think I'm like that. I must not decide on my own performance. He made no answer, and they were again silent till they had gone down the dance. And when he asked her if she and her sister did not very often walk to Meryton, she answered in the affirmative, and unable to resist the temptation, added, "When you met us there the other day, we had just been forming a new acquaintance." The effect was immediate. A deeper shade of hauteur overspread his features, but he said not a word, and Elizabeth, though blaming herself for her own weakness, could not go on. At length Darcy spoke in a constrained manner, said, "Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as may ensure his making friends. Whether he may be equally capable of retaining them is less certain." So he knows that she's bringing up the last time they walked to Meryton, how he saw Mr. Wickham. I mean, he's the one who brought up Meryton, but she's saying, "Oh yeah, we had just made a new friend when we saw you there last time." He's like, "Well, Mr. Wickham is so nice. He doesn't have a hard time making friends, but he doesn't keep them very long." "He has been so unlucky as to lose your friendship," replied Elizabeth with emphasis, "and in a manner which he is likely to suffer from all his life." Darcy made no answer and seemed desirous of changing the subject. At that moment Sir William Lucas appeared close to them, meaning to pass through the set to the other side of the room, but on perceiving Mr. Darcy, he stopped with a bow of superior courtesy to compliment him on his dancing and his partner. "I have been most highly gratified indeed, my dear sir. Such very superior dancing is not often seen. It is evident that you belong to the first circles. Allow me to say, however, that your fair partner does not disgrace you, and that I must hope to have this pleasure often repeated, especially when a certain desirable event may, my dear Miss Eliza," glancing at her sister and Bingley, "shall take place. What congratulations will then flow in?" I appealed to Mr. Darcy. "But let me not interrupt you, sir. You will not thank me for detaining you from the bewitching converse of that young lady, whose bright eyes are also upbraiding me." So Sir William Lucas, he stops him and says, "Hey, yeah, y'all are dancing so well." He's like, "I hope to see y'all dancing again at their wedding." And he's not talking about their wedding. He's talking about Bingley's and Jane's. He's like, "Oh yeah, look at them. They might get married. So, at their wedding, maybe y'all can dance again." So the latter part of this address was scarcely heard by Darcy, but Sir William's allusion to his friend seemed to strike him forcibly, and his eyes were directed with a very serious expression towards Bingley and Jane, who were dancing together. So Darcy's like, "What?" And he looks over at Bingley and Jane. He's like, "Oh, so maybe this is news to him that Bingley likes Jane that much." I don't know, but Darcy had a serious expression on his face. Recovering himself, however, shortly, he turned to his partner and said, "Sir William's interruption has made me forget what we were talking of. I do not think we were speaking at all. Sir William could not have interrupted any two people in the room who had less to say for themselves. We have tried 2 or 3 subjects already without success, and what we are to talk of next I cannot imagine." "What think you of books?" he said, smiling. Oh, how cute. He's trying to have conversation with her. She's like, "No, we've already tried several times and we just can't talk. We don't have anything in common." So he said, "Oh, what about books?" "Books? Oh no, I am sure we never read the same, nor not with the same feelings." "I am sorry you think so, but if that be the case, there can at least be no want of subject. We may compare our different opinions. Or if they read the same books, maybe they can talk about their opinions of them, right? At least discuss them." "No, I cannot talk of books in a ballroom. My head is always full of something else." "The present always occupies you in such scenes, does it?" he said, with a look of doubt. "Yes, always," she replied, without knowing what she said, for her thoughts had wandered far from the subject, as soon afterwards appeared by her suddenly exclaiming, "I remember hearing you once say, Mr. Darcy, that you hardly ever forgave, that your resentment once created was unappeasable. You are very cautious, I suppose, as to its being created." "I am," said he, with a firm voice. "And never allow yourself to be blinded by prejudice?" "I hope not." "It is particularly incumbent on those who never change their opinion to be secure of judging properly at first." So she's like, "So you judge quickly. So you try to not put yourself in the position to judge quickly because you do that." He's like, "Yeah, I don't want to judge quickly, so I don't put myself in those positions. May I ask to what these questions tend?" "Merely to the illustration of your character," said she, endeavoring to shake off her gravity. "I'm trying to make it out." "And what is your success?" She shook her head. "I do not get on at all. I hear such different accounts of you as puzzle me exceedingly." I can readily believe, answered he gravely, that report may vary greatly with respect to me, and I could wish, Miss Bennet, that you were not to sketch my character at the present moment, as there is reason to fear that the performance would reflect no credit on either. He was like, oh, well, I'd hope you wouldn't judge me right now, because basically she's being influenced by other things. But didn't he just say he does that? He judges quickly? It's like, what the heck? But if I do not take your likeness now, I may never have another opportunity. I would by no means suspend any pleasure of yours, he coldly replied. She said no more, and they went down the other distance and parted in silence, on each side dissatisfied, though not to an equal degree. For in Darcy's breast there was a tolerable, powerful feeling towards her, which soon procured her pardon and directed all his anger against another. So when they parted, they were each dissatisfied with the dance, but for him, he was not satisfied because he was like, oh my gosh, like in my chest, like I just feel like so much anger. But for Wickham, he basically forgave her immediately for like just kind of being a jerk right now, and he's upset with Wickham. But for her, she probably just straight up just doesn't like Darcy, you know. They had not long separated when Miss Bingley came towards her, and with an expression of civil disdain, thus accosted her. So Miss Bingley, this is Mr. Bingley's sister. So, Miss Eliza, I hear you are quite delighted with George Wickham. Your sister has been talking to me about him and asking me 1,000 questions, and I find that the young man forgot to tell you, among his other communications, that he was the son of old Wickham, the late Mr. Darcy's steward. Let me recommend you, however, as a friend, not to give implicit confidence to all his assertions. For as to Mr. Darcy's using him ill, it is perfectly false. For on the contrary, he has been always remarkably kind to him, though George Wickham has treated Mr. Darcy in a most infamous manner. I do not know the particulars, but I know very well that Mr. Darcy is not in the least to blame, that he cannot bear to hear George Wickham mentioned, and that though my brother thought he could not well avoid including him in his invitation to the officers, he was excessively glad to find that he had taken himself out of the way. His coming into the country at all is a most insolent thing indeed, and I wonder how he could presume to do it. I pity you, Miss Eliza, for this discovery of your favourite's guilt, but really, considering his descent, one could not expect much better. So here comes Miss Bingley trying to defend Darcy. She's like, I know what you've heard. It's all lies. Wickham is a jerkwad. He's the one who was mean to Mr. Darcy, but she also says she doesn't know exactly what happened. So I was like, maybe Miss Bingley's blindly taking Darcy's side if she doesn't even know what happened. So I was like, how can you trust her, you know? His guilt and his descent appear by your account to be the same, said Elizabeth angrily, for I have heard you accuse him of nothing worse than of being the son of Mr. Darcy's steward, and of that I can assure you he informed me himself. I beg your pardon, replied Miss Bingley, turning away with a sneer. Excuse my interference. It was kindly meant. Insolent girl, said Elizabeth to herself. You are much mistaken if you expect to influence me by such a paltry attack as this. So Elizabeth is talking to herself, okay? I see nothing in it but your own willful ignorance and the malice of Mr. Darcy. She then sought her eldest sister, who had undertaken to make inquiries on the same subject of Bingley. Jane met her with a smile of such sweet complacency, a glow of such happy expression, and sufficiently marked how well she was satisfied with the occurrences of the evening. Elizabeth instantly read her feelings, and at that moment solicitude for William, resentment against his enemies, and everything else gave way before the hopes of James being in the fairest way for happiness. I want to know, said she, with a countenance no less smiling than her sister's, what you have learned about Mr. Wickham. Perhaps you have been too pleasantly engaged to think of any third person, in which case you may be sure of my pardon. No, replied Jane, I have not forgotten him, but I have nothing satisfactory to tell you. Mr. Bingley does not know the whole of his history, and is quite ignorant of the circumstances which have principally offended Mr. Darcy, but he will vouch for the good conduct, the probity and honor of his friend, and is perfectly convinced that Mr. Wickham has deserved much less attention from Mr. Darcy than he has received, and I am sorry to say that by his account, as well as his sister's, Mr. Wickham is by no means a respectable young man. I am afraid he has been very imprudent and has deserved to lose Mr. Darcy's regard. She's like, yeah, no, I didn't hear good things about Mr. Wickham. Sorry. Mr. Bingley does not know Mr. Wickham himself? No, he never saw him till the other morning at Meryton. This account, then, is what he has received from Mr. Darcy. I am perfectly satisfied, but what does he say of the living? So he's like, Mr. Bingley doesn't know him either. So all that Mr. Bingley knows of Mr. Wickham is what Darcy told him. So of course Darcy's going to tell him all the bad stuff. So Elizabeth's like, nah, I don't believe Bingley at all. She doesn't even know Wickham, or he doesn't even know Wickham. He does not exactly recollect the circumstances, though he has heard from Mr. Darcy more than once, but he believes that it was left to him conditionally only. So they're talking about the job that Wickham was supposed to have. It was left conditionally. So under certain conditions, Wickham was going to be the minister of that church. I have not a doubt of Mr. Bingley's sincerity, said Elizabeth warmly, but you must excuse my not being convinced by assurances only. Mr. Bingley's defense of his friend was a very able one, I dare say, but since he is acquainted with several parts of the story, he has learned the rest from that friend himself. I shall venture to still think of both gentlemen as I did before. So Elizabeth's like, yeah, no, nobody knows the whole story, so no, I'm just going to think what I did before. She then changed the discourse to one more gratifying to each, and on which there could be no difference of sentiment. Elizabeth listened with delight to the happy though modest hopes which Jane entertained of Bingley's regard, and said all in her power to heighten her confidence in it. On their being joined by Mr. Bingley himself, Elizabeth withdrew to Miss Lucas, whose inquiry after the pleasantness of her last partner she had scarcely replied before Mr. Collins came up to them and told her with great exultation that he had just been so fortunate as to make a most important discovery. So it feels so Elizabeth is talking to Jane. They discuss that whole business with Mr. Wickham, and so they change the subject and they start talking about Mr. Bingley and how great things have been for Jane that night. And then so now she's talking to Charlotte, and here comes Mr. Collins, and oh gosh, he made a discovery. And this is what it is. I have found out, he said, by a singular accident, that there is now in the room a near relation of my patroness. That there's a relative of Lady Catherine de Bourgh's. I happened to overhear the gentleman himself mentioning to the young lady who does the honors of this house the names of his cousin Mr. Bourgh, and of her mother, Lady Catherine. How wonderfully these sort of things occur! Who would have thought of my meeting with, perhaps, the nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh in this assembly? I am most thankful that the discovery is made in time for me to pay my respects to him, which I am now going to do, and trust he will excuse my not having done it before. My total ignorance of the connection must plead my apology. You were not going to introduce yourself to Mr. Darcy. So she's like, whoa, you can't go introduce yourself. Somebody needs to introduce you to him. That's just the rules of decorum. That's what we do. You can't just go walk up to people. So American. Indeed I am. I shall entreat his pardon for not having done it earlier. I believe him to be Lady Catherine's nephew. It will be in my power to assure him that her ladyship was quite well yesterday se'nnight. Elizabeth tried hard to dissuade him from such a scheme, assuring him that Mr. Darcy would consider his addressing him without introduction as an impertinent freedom rather than a compliment to his aunt, that it was not in the least necessary there should be any notice on either side, and that if it were, it must belong to Mr. Darcy, the superior, in consequence, to begin the acquaintance. She's like, no, you cannot go introduce yourself to Mr. Darcy. He's going to see it as like, a bother. If anything, Mr. Darcy, because he's higher or better than you, he needs to come and introduce himself to you. That's the way it works. Mr. Collins listened to Elizabeth with the determined air of following his own inclination, and when she ceased speaking, he thus replied, My dear Miss Elizabeth, I have the highest opinion in the world of your excellent judgment in all matters within the scope of your understanding. But permit me to say that there must be a wide difference between the established forms of ceremony amongst the laity and those which regulate the clergy. He's like, oh, no, I can do this because I'm of the clergy. Forgive me leave to observe that I consider the clerical office as equal in point of dignity with the highest rank of the kingdom. He thinks that the clerical office of the clergy as equal in point of dignity in the highest rank in the kingdom. What's the highest rank in the kingdom? To be the king. He thinks it's equal. He must be out of his mind. Provided that a proper humility of behavior is at the same time maintained. You must therefore allow me to follow the the dictates of my conscience on this occasion, which leads me to perform what I look on as a point of duty. Pardon me for neglecting to profit by your advice, on which every subject shall be my constant guide, though in the case before us I consider myself more fitted by education and habitual study to decide on what is right than a young lady like yourself. So he's basically telling her, like, yeah, you're not educated enough to know what is right and wrong about this situation, so I'm just going to go do what I'm going to do. And with a low bow, he left her to attack Mr. Darcy, whose reception of his advances she eagerly watched, and whose astonishment at being so addressed was very evident. Her cousin prefaced his speech with a solemn bow, and though she could not hear a word of it, she felt as if hearing it all, and saw in the motion of his lips the words apology, Hunsford, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. It vexed her to see him expose himself to such a man. Mr. Darcy was eyeing him with unrestrained wonder, and when at last Mr. Collins allowed him time to speak, he replied with an air of distant civility. So Elizabeth's just watching from a distance like, oh my gosh, Mr. Collins is so embarrassing. Mr. Collins, however, was not discouraged from speaking again, and Mr. Darcy's contempt seemed abundantly increasing with the length of his second speech, and at the end of it, he only made him a slight bow and moved another way. Mr. Collins then returned to Elizabeth. So Mr. Darcy was like, oh my gosh, this guy's talking to me again. And so he just like, and he leaves. He doesn't ever respond to Mr. Collins' second time. So embarrassing. I have no reason, I assure. So Collins comes back to talk to Elizabeth about what just happened. I have no reason, I assure you, he said, to be dissatisfied with my reception. Mr. Darcy seemed much pleased with the attention. He answered me with the utmost civility, and even paid me the compliment of saying that he was so well convinced of Lady Catherine's discernment as to be certain she could never bestow a favor unworthily. It was really a very handsome thought. Upon the whole, I am much pleased with him. As Elizabeth had no longer any interest of her own to pursue, she turned her attention almost entirely on her sister and Mr. Bingley, and the train of agreeable reflections with her observations gave birth to made her perhaps almost as happy as Jane. She saw her in idea settled in that very house in all the felicity which a marriage of true affection could bestow, and she felt capable under such circumstances of endeavoring even to like Bingley's two sisters. So Elizabeth was like, there's nothing else to do. I'm just going to make sure Jane is happy. And she looked happy. Elizabeth even imagined Jane living in that very house after their marriage. Her mother's thoughts, she plainly saw, were bent the same way, and she determined not to venture near her lest she might hear too much. When they sat down to supper, therefore, she considered it a most unlucky perverseness which placed them within one of each other, and deeply she was vexed to find that her mother was talking to that one person, Lady Lucas, freely, openly, and of nothing else but of her expectation that Jane would soon be married to Mr. Bingley. Oh my gosh, the mom! They're at dinner, and she's sitting near Elizabeth, and so Elizabeth can hear her talking to Miss Lucas and saying, oh, and how she expects her daughter to be married to Mr. Bingley and this and that. And it's like, dude, he hasn't even asked her yet. Like, settle down. She's being embarrassing. It was an animating subject, and Mrs. Bennet seemed incapable of fatigue while enumerating the advantages of the match. His being such a charming young man and so rich and living but 3 miles from them were the first points of self-gratulation. And then it was such a comfort to think how fond the two sisters were of Jane, and to be certain that they must desire the connection as much as she could do. It was, moreover, such a promising thing for her younger daughters, as Jane's marrying so greatly must throw them in the way of other rich men. So the mom's saying all this at dinner, saying, oh, it's an advantageous marriage, and it's an advantage to us if she gets married to this guy, because my daughters will be in the same company as other rich guys, and maybe they can marry rich guys too. I mean, that's pretty embarrassing, especially because Bingley hasn't even asked Jane, right? And lastly, it was so pleasant at her time of life to be able to consign her single daughter to the care of their sister, that she might not be obliged to go into company more than she liked. So she's basically saying that when Jane gets married, her daughters are going to go be with her all the time, because the mom just can't, take care of them well anymore, because she doesn't want to go out in public. It was necessary to make this circumstance a matter of pleasure, because on each because on such occasions it is the etiquette, but no one was less likely than Mrs. Bennet to find comfort in staying at home at any period of her life. She concluded with many good wishes that Lady Lucas might soon be equally fortunate, though evidently and triumphantly believing there was no chance of it. She was like, oh, I hope your daughter Charlotte will be married soon too. And fat chance, right? In vain did Elizabeth endeavor to check the rapidity of her mother's words. She was like, Mom, be quiet, right? Or she persuaded her to describe her felicity in a less audible whisper, for to her inexpressible vexation, she could perceive that the chief of it was overheard by Mr. Darcy, who sat opposite to them. Her mother only scolded her for being nonsensical. What is Mr. Darcy to me, pray, that I should be afraid of him? I am sure we owe him no such particular civility as to be obliged to say nothing he may not like to hear. Elizabeth's like, Mom, you're being so embarrassing. And Mr. Darcy can hear it all. For heaven's sake, madam, speak lower. What advantage can it be to you offend Mr. Darcy? You will never recommend yourself to his friend by so doing. Nothing that she could say, however, had any influence. Her mother would talk in her views in the same intelligible tone. Elizabeth blushed and blushed again with shame and vexation. She could not help frequently glancing her eye at Mr. Darcy, though every glance convinced her of what she dreaded, for though he was not always looking at her mother, she was convinced that his attention was invariably fixed by her. The expression of his face changed gradually from indignant contempt to a composed and steady gravity. At length, however, Mrs. Bennet had no more to say, and Lady Lucas, who had been long yawning at the receptions of delights which she saw no likelihood of sharing, was left to the comforts of cold ham and chicken. Elizabeth now began to revive, but not long was the interval of tranquillity. She's like, oh, thank goodness, Mom, she's quiet now, and I'm feeling better. But it didn't last long. For when supper was over, singing was talked of, and she had the mortification of seeing Mary, after very little entreaty, preparing to oblige the company. She's like, oh my gosh, my sister's going to play the piano now. By many significant looks and silent entreaties did she endeavor to prevent such a reproof of complaisance, but in vain. Mary would not understand them. So from a distance, Elizabeth's like, stop it, no, stop. But Mary doesn't get it. Mary would not understand them. Such an opportunity of exhibiting was delightful to her, and she began her song. Elizabeth's eyes were fixed on her with most painful sensations, and she watched her progress through the several stanzas with an impatience which was very ill rewarded at their close, for Mary, on receiving amongst the thanks of the table the hint of a hope that she might be prevailed on to favor them again, after the pause of half a minute, began another. Mary's powers by no means fitted for such a display. Her voice was weak and her manner affected. So Mary played the piano and she sang, but she was doing so terribly, and it was just so embarrassing in front of all those people. Elizabeth was in agonies. She looked at Jane to see how she bore it, but Jane was very composedly talking to Bingley. She looked at his two sisters and saw them making signs of derision at each other and at Darcy, who continued, however, impenetrably grave. She looked at her father to entreat his interference, lest Mary should be singing all night. He took the hint, and when Mary had finished her second song, said aloud, "That will do extremely well, child. You have delighted us long enough. Let the other young ladies have time to exhibit." I mean, everybody knows why he did that. I mean, because she was doing a bad job. You know what I'm saying? Ooh, how embarrassing. Mary, though pretending not to hear, was somewhat disconcerted, and Elizabeth, sorry for her and sorry for her father's speech, was afraid her anxiety had done no good. Others of the party were now applied to. "If I," said Mr. Collins, "were so fortunate as to be able to sing, I should have great pleasure, I am sure, in obliging the company with an air. For I consider music as a very innocent diversion, and perfectly compatible with the profession of a clergyman. I do not mean, however, to assert that we can be justified in devoting too much of our time to music, for there are certainly other things to be attended to. The rector of a parish has much to do. In the first place, he must make such an agreement for tithes as may be beneficial to himself and not offensive to his patron. He must write his own sermons, and the time that remains will not be too much for his parish duties and the care and improvement of his dwelling, which he cannot be excused from making as comfortable as possible. And I do not think it of light importance that he should have attentive and conciliatory manners toward everybody, especially towards those to whom he owes his preferment. I cannot acquit him of that duty, nor could I think well of the man who should omit an occasion of testifying his respect towards anybody connected with the family. What in the world? Mr. Collins had to make that big old speech right after Mary got off the piano, saying, "Oh, I would play the piano because I think if I had a talent, because I think a clergyman should be able to do that." And he listed all his other duties. Why would he do that in front of everybody? It's like he made a speech about himself. And not just that, but about how he thinks it right to basically speak to anybody in connection with his family. Not his family, but Lady Catherine de Bourgh's family. And with a bow to Mr. Darcy, he concluded his speech, which had been spoken so loud as to be heard by half the room. Many stared. That's embarrassing too, right? So the mom was embarrassing. Mary playing the song and playing terribly was embarrassing. The dad saying, "Hey, okay, Mary, that's enough." That's embarrassing. Mr. Collins giving this big old speech for Mr. Darcy for half the room was embarrassing. So many smiled, but no one looked more amused than Mr. Bennet himself, while his wife seriously commended Mr. Collins for having spoken so sensibly, and observed in a half whisper to Lady Lucas that he was a remarkably clever, good kind of young man. To Elizabeth, it appeared that had her family made an agreement to expose themselves as much as they could during the evening, it would have been impossible for them to play their parts with more spirit or finer success. She's like, "Oh my gosh, did my family make a plan to be as embarrassing as possible? And if they did, well, darn, they're doing a darn good job." And happy did she think it for Bingley and her sister that some of the exhibition had escaped his notice, and that his feelings were not of a sort to be much distressed by the folly which he must have witnessed. That his two sisters and Mr. Darcy, however, should have such an opportunity of ridiculing her relations was bad enough, and she could not determine whether the silent contempt of the gentlemen or the insolent smiles of the ladies were more intolerable. The rest of the evening brought her little amusement. She was teased by Mr. Collins, who continued most perseveringly by her side, and though he could not prevail with her to dance with him again, put it out of her power to dance with others. So Mr. Collins is just like chicle on Elizabeth. So other guys couldn't even ask her to dance, and he kept asking her. She's like, no, get out of my face. I mean, she didn't say that, but other guys couldn't ask her to dance. So in vain did she entreat him to stand up with somebody else, and offered to introduce him to any young lady in the room. She even said, "Dude, I don't want to dance. Here, let me introduce you to another girl so you can dance with her." And it didn't work. He assured her that as to dancing, he was perfectly indifferent to it, that his chief object was by delicate attentions to recommend himself to her, and that he should therefore make a point in remaining close to her the whole evening. He's like, no, I don't want to dance with anybody. I actually want to just be with you tonight and just hang out with you. There was no arguing upon such a project. She owed her greatest relief to her friend Miss Lucas, who often joined them and good-naturedly engaged Mr. Collins's conversation to herself. She's like, thank goodness Charlotte is here so he can talk to Charlotte, because I am done with this guy. So Charlotte helped her out a little bit. She was at least free from the offense of Mr. Darcy's further notice, though often standing within a very short distance of her, quite disengaged. She never came near enough to speak. She felt it to be the probable consequence of her allusions to Mr. Wickham, and rejoiced in it. She's like, thank goodness, Mr. Darcy's staying over there too. I don't want to talk to him either. The Longbourn party were the last of all the company to depart. They were the last to leave the party. How annoying. And by a maneuver of Mrs. Bennet, had to wait for their carriages a quarter of an hour after everybody else was gone, which gave them time to see how heartily they were wished away by some of the family. They were overstaying their welcome. Oh my gosh. Mrs. Hurst and her sister scarcely opened their mouths except to complain of fatigue, and were evidently impatient to have the house to themselves. They repulsed every attempt of Mrs. Bennet at conversation, and by so doing threw a languor over the whole party, which was very little relieved by the long speeches of Mr. Collins, who was complimenting Mr. Bingley and his sisters on the elegance of their entertainment, and the hospitality and politeness which had marked their behaviour to their guests. Darcy said nothing at all. Mr. Bennet, in equal silence, was enjoying the scene. Mr. Bingley and Jane were standing together, a little detached from the rest, and talked only to each other. Elizabeth preserved as steady a silence as either Mrs. Hurst or Miss Bingley, and even Lydia was much too fatigued to utter more than the occasional exclamation of "Lord, how tired I am!" accompanied by a violent yawn. When at length they arose to take leave, Mrs. Bennet was most pressingly civil in her hope of seeing the whole family soon at Longbourn, and addressed herself particularly to Mr. Bingley to assure him how happy he would make them by eating a family dinner with them at any time, without the ceremony of a formal invitation. Bingley was all grateful pleasure, and he readily engaged for taking the earliest opportunity of waiting on her after his return from Longbourn, whether he was obliged to go the next day for a short time. So, Mrs. Bennet did something, they didn't say exactly what, but it made them wait 15 minutes longer for their carriage, and everybody was just like, goodness gracious, can they just leave already? And when they left, Mom was inviting Mr. Bingley to the house, right? So still, Mrs. Bennet was perfectly satisfied and quitted the house under the delightful persuasion that, allowing for the necessary preparations of settlements, new carriages, and wedding clothes, she should undoubtedly see her daughter settled at Netherfield in the course of 3 or 4 months. So Mrs. Bennet is super sure, she's so confident that Jane and Bingley are going to be together. Of having another daughter married to Mr. Collins, she thought with equal certainty, and with considerable though not equal pleasure. Elizabeth was the least dear to her of all her children. Ah, that's sad. Elizabeth was the least dear to her of all her children, and though the man and the match were quite good enough for her, the worth of each was eclipsed by Mr. Bingley in Netherfield. Ah, so, I mean, we know that Miss Bennet wants her kids to get married, right? So she's like, great, Jane's going to be married, and so is Elizabeth, but who cares about Elizabeth? Whatever. That's sad.